Whispers in the dark. In the quiet, forgotten town of Whispering Pines, a mansion known as Holloway House stood on the outskirts, a place dreaded and shunned by the locals. It was a dwelling whispered about in hushed tones, a place where eerie tales were born. But for a group of reckless teenagers, curiosity outweighed fear, and a dare was all it took to set their fate in motion. Among them was Alex, the charismatic instigator, who had a knack for persuading others into situations they'd later regret. Sarah, the thrill-seeker with a love for the unknown, was eager to explore the haunted mansion. Ryan, the skeptical one, often found himself swept up in his friends' adventures, and Emily, the quiet, bookish one, had reluctantly agreed to join the escapade. On a moonless night, the four friends gathered on the decaying porch of Holloway House, their flashlights flickering in the inky darkness. Alex, with a sly grin, challenged them all to spend the night inside the notorious Pierce Mansion. The mansion had stood abandoned for decades, its last known residents meeting a tragic and mysterious end. As they ventured inside, the air grew heavy with the weight of the house's history. Shadows seemed to dance in the corners and eerie whispers drifted from the walls. Sarah, undeterred by the growing unease, led the way with her flashlight, her steps echoing through the creaking halls. The teenagers explored room after room, their laughter gradually fading as the oppressive atmosphere pressed upon them. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper, and cobwebs hung like tattered curtains. Each step seemed to take them further from the safety of the outside world. Descending into the basement, the temperature dropped, and their breath misted in the frigid air. A sense of foreboding washed over them, but they pressed on, determined to prove their courage. Ryan muttered that it was all just an elaborate hoax, a way for the town to keep them away from the mansion. Their bravado waned as they reached a dimly lit chamber deep within the basement. An old piano sat in the corner, its keys worn and dusty. Emily shivered, feeling as though they were being watched. Alex, eager to maintain his fearless facade, challenged them to play a haunting melody on the decrepit instrument. Sarah hesitated, but finally placed her fingers on the keys. As the first notes rang out, the temperature dropped further, and the room seemed to close in on them. A chilling breeze swept through, and the door slammed shut, leaving them in complete darkness. Panic set in as they fumbled for their flashlights, their beams revealing a room that had transformed. The walls were now adorned with ghastly paintings, their subjects twisted and contorted in agony. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and distant whispers grew louder, their words incomprehensible. As the terrified teenagers searched for an escape, they realized that Emily was missing. She had been there just moments ago, but now she was nowhere to be found. Desperate, they called out her name, their voices trembling with fear. With dread mounting, they decided to retrace their steps and find a way out. But as they climbed the basement stairs and entered the corridor, they found themselves in a never-ending maze of twisting hallways. The mansion had become a labyrinth, its walls closing in on them. Sarah, her voice shaky, insisted that they needed to stick together. But Alex and Ryan were growing increasingly agitated. Accusations were thrown, and fear drove a wedge between them. They separated, each convinced that they could find their way out on their own. As the minutes turned into hours, Sarah realized with growing despair that they were not alone in the mansion. Shadowy figures darted in and out of her flashlight's beam, and eerie whispers filled the air. The presence that had watched them from the moment they entered was now closing in, its intentions unclear but undeniably malevolent. She called out for her friends, but there was no response. Panic set in as she continued to wander the ever-shifting labyrinth of the mansion. Time seemed to lose all meaning, and she couldn't tell whether it had been minutes or days since they first entered. Sarah's flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in total darkness. She could feel the malevolent presence drawing closer, its whispers growing louder and more insistent. She was certain that she was not alone in the darkness, that something was lurking just beyond her sight. With a trembling hand, she pulled out her phone and turned on its feeble flashlight. The beam revealed a nightmarish tableau, distorted faces leering from the walls, and the walls themselves seemed to writhe and pulse as though they were alive. Desperation drove her forward, and she ran through the labyrinthine halls, calling out for her friends one last time. But the mansion seemed determined to keep its secrets, and it swallowed her cries in its suffocating silence. The house on Harrow Hill. The house on Harrow Hill was not like any other house in the small, forgotten town of Willowbrook. It stood perched atop the highest point in the area, overlooking the town with an air of sinister elegance. Its dark, looming presence was enough to send shivers down the spine of anyone who dared to pass by. For generations, the townsfolk had whispered tales of the house. They said it was cursed, that the souls of those who had died within its walls still roamed the halls, seeking vengeance on the living. But those were just stories, weren't they? Jameson had recently moved to Willowbrook in search of a quieter life. He was a writer, seeking inspiration in the tranquility of the countryside. When he first laid eyes on the house on Harrow Hill, he felt a strange and irresistible pull toward it. It was as though the house had called out to him, promising untold tales of horror and mystery. One gloomy afternoon, Jameson decided to explore the town. As he wandered the quaint streets, he couldn't help but be drawn to the house on Harrow Hill. It was as if an invisible hand was guiding him toward it. The overgrown path leading to the house was narrow and tangled with thorns, but Jameson pressed on, fueled by an insatiable curiosity. The closer he got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The wind whispered through the trees, and the house itself seemed to breathe with a malevolent presence. The front door was a massive weathered oak, adorned with intricate carvings of grotesque faces. Jameson hesitated for only a moment before he pushed it open, revealing the darkness that awaited inside. The foyer was vast and cavernous, with a grand staircase that spiraled up into the unknown. Cobwebs hung from the chandeliers, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Jameson's footsteps echoed through the empty halls as he ventured deeper into the house, guided by the flickering candlelight that seemed to appear out of nowhere. As he explored, he discovered a library filled with ancient books, their pages filled with cryptic symbols and long-forgotten incantations. He found a ballroom with a grand piano that played haunting melodies on its own, its keys moving as if touched by unseen hands. Each room seemed to have a life of its own, and Jameson couldn't help but feel like a guest in a macabre theater. But it was when he entered the master bedroom that things took a truly terrifying turn. The room was adorned with faded portraits of a family long gone, and a heavy canopy bed stood against one wall. As Jameson approached, he saw a figure lying under the covers, a shadowy silhouette that should not have been there. He reached out a trembling hand to pull back the covers, revealing the face of a woman, her eyes hollow and her skin ashen. She was unmistakably dead, yet her presence was undeniably real. As he recoiled in horror, the woman's eyes snapped open and a chilling whisper escaped her lips. "Help me." Jameson stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman's spectral form floated above the bed, her eyes fixed on him. It was then that he noticed the blood-stained wedding dress she wore, and he realized that she was the bride who had died on her wedding day, a tragedy that had become a local legend. In his panic, Jameson fled the room and raced down the stairs, but the house seemed to shift and change around him, trapping him in a never-ending maze of twisting corridors. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, closing in on him with each passing moment. As he stumbled through the house, he heard voices whispering in the darkness, the anguished cries of lost souls. The spirits of the house were not content to remain silent any longer. They hungered for release, for justice, and they saw in Jameson a means to achieve it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jameson burst through the front door and into the blinding sunlight. The house on Harrow Hill loomed behind him, its dark presence still palpable. He fled down the overgrown path, not looking back, and as he reached the town below, he could hear the anguished cries of the spirits growing fainter and fainter. Jameson never returned to the house on Harrow Hill. He left Willowbrook, vowing never to speak of his nightmarish encounter, but the memory of the haunted house would haunt him for the rest of his days, a reminder that some secrets are best left buried, and some houses are best left abandoned to the ghosts that dwell within. The Haunting of the Hollywood House. Nestled deep within the woods, far from prying eyes, the Hollywood House lay in wait. Its reputation was notorious in the nearby town, whispered tales of eerie happenings and ghostly apparitions that had plagued the estate for generations. None dared to enter except for one family, the Carters, who were drawn to the house by a peculiar fascination. Richard Carter, a historian with a penchant for the paranormal, saw the dilapidated mansion as an opportunity to uncover the secrets of the supernatural. His wife, Emily, shared his sense of adventure, while their two children, Lucy and Daniel, were too young to understand the true nature of the house they were moving into. The first night in their new home was marked by an eerie calm. The house was vast, filled with echoing rooms and creaking hallways. It bore the weight of a dark history, and the Carters could feel its oppressive presence. Yet the allure of the unknown drove them to stay. Soon after they settled in, strange occurrences began to haunt them. The temperature would plummet inexplicably, and objects would move on their own. Muffled whispers echoed in the dead of night, voices that spoke of suffering and torment. Lucy and Daniel began to have vivid nightmares of a shadowy figure that lurked in the corners of their rooms. Richard, undeterred by the strange happenings, delved into the history of the house. He discovered records of a family that had once lived there, the Hollywoods, whose tragic fate had sealed the house's dark reputation. Rumors abounded of a malevolent demon, Banneker, who was said to have possessed the patriarch of the Hollywood family, driving him to madness and murder. One evening, as Emily was reading to Lucy and Daniel in the living room, a sudden chill descended upon the room. The children shivered, their eyes wide with fear, and Emily looked up to see her husband standing in the doorway, his eyes empty and hollow. Richard's voice, tinged with an otherworldly coldness, spoke words that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "Banneker calls." With that, Richard turned and walked away, leaving Emily and the children trembling in his wake. She rushed after him, finding him in their bedroom, standing before a mirror that seemed to radiate a malevolent energy. Richard's reflection was distorted, his features twisted into a grotesque semblance of himself. In a voice that was not his own, Richard said, "Banneker demands blood." Terrified, Emily grabbed her children and fled the room, locking the door behind her. She knew that something had possessed her husband, something dark and malevolent that sought to harm their family. As the days passed, Richard's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would disappear for hours on end, returning with vacant eyes and strange symbols etched into his flesh. He spoke of visions and whispered secrets, his words disjointed and incomprehensible. The once loving father and husband had become a stranger in their midst. One night, as the family huddled together in the dimly lit living room, they heard the sound of chanting emanating from the basement. The voice was Richard's, but it was distorted, filled with a sinister power that sent shivers down their spines. The chanting grew louder, and the air seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Lucy and Daniel clung to their mother, tears in their eyes, as the basement door swung open on its own. Richard descended the stairs, his eyes ablaze with an unholy fire, a wicked smile curling his lips. In his hand he held a knife, its blade glinting in the dim light. "Banneker demands a sacrifice," he intoned, his voice a sickening mix of ecstasy and madness. Emily's heart raced as she realized the horrifying truth. Her husband was under the control of the demon Banneker, and it hungered for the blood of their family. With a surge of desperation, she grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it at Richard, striking him across the head. He staggered back, dropping the knife, and the spell that had held him seemed to break. The family fled the house, leaving behind their possessed father and the malevolent entity that had taken hold of him. As they reached the safety of the woods, they heard Richard's agonized screams echoing from within the house, followed by an eerie silence. They never returned to the Hollywood house, their lives forever scarred by the nightmarish ordeal. The family had learned that some houses are best left abandoned, their dark histories and malevolent spirits lurking in the shadows, waiting to consume the souls of those who dare to enter. Richard's fate remained a mystery, a testament to the enduring horror of the Hollywood house and the demon that dwelled within.